All right, so we're going to continue with Chapter 3, Section 3. This is Part 2. But we are still going to be completing the square. So we did these two questions in class on Thursday when we went over completing the square. I'm going to do one more example just below it to practice what we did on Thursday, just to refresh our memories a little bit. So let's say I had something like x squared plus 6x plus 10. So I don't have two factors of 10 that add to 6, so I can't just factor it. So I have to use another strategy that we learned on how to solve for x, and that is completing the square. So the first thing we want to do to complete the square is move the 10 to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 10 on both sides. So I'm left with x squared plus 6x. I'm going to leave a space because I know I'm going to complete the square, so what completes the square is going to go in that space, and it's equal to negative 10. Now our formula to complete the square is b over 2 squared, and that b always comes from the number that's being multiplied to just the x, the solo x there. So my b would be 6, so this would be 6 over 2 squared. 6 over 2 simplifies to 3, so this would be 3 squared, and 3 squared is 9. In my parentheses squared, I take the squared term and the squared term and put those together. So this would be x plus 3. But here, I just made this 9 up. I put this 3 squared, this 6 over 2 squared into my equation out of nowhere. So I'm technically adding 9 on the left side, so I also have to add 9 on the right side too. So then this would be equal to, I add these two together, so negative 10 plus 9 would be negative 1. Now from here we know how to solve from what we did on the last quiz. So I want to take the square root of both sides to get that squared to cancel. So then I have x plus 3 on the left. Anytime we take the square root of both sides, we have to include a plus or minus. So this would be plus or minus, and we know the square root of negative 1 is I. So plus or minus I. Always simplify your square root if it can be simplified. So here we could take out the negative, make it an I, and the square root of 1 is just 1. So it would be 1I, but we know that we don't write the 1 in front of the I, so it's just plus or minus I. And then the last step we do is to get the x all by itself, so I need to subtract 3 on both sides. So x is equal to, I always need to ask myself, can I combine the 3 and the I? If we can combine them, we got to split it up and add it together separately. But here I can't combine it. 3 and I are not like terms, so it would be negative 3 plus or minus I. And that's our answer. So that is how we complete the square. So every time we complete the square, it's going to be these same steps. You need your x's on one side. Then you need to include your formula, that b over 2 squared. Then you're going to make up your parentheses squared, and then square root both sides, and then simplify from there. So every single time you complete the square, it's going to be these same steps. All right, next we're going to be solving by completing the square when a is not 1. So that number in front of the x squared is not 1. So we're going to be doing the same steps. It's just one extra step to start. So we always just want to get that x squared to have a coefficient of 1. So I'm going to take out the GCF. I'm going to divide everything by whatever number is in front of that x squared to get rid of it. So when you divide everything in the equation by that number, it gets rid of that number. So here it cancels. So I'm left with x squared. 12x divided by 3 would be 4x. 15 divided by 3 is 5, and then that's equal to 0. Now for any type of question like this, we always want to see, do I have two factors of 5 that add to 4? I do not, so I can't just factor it. I have to use one of my other strategies to solve. So that is going to be completing the square. This question says solve by completing the square, so that's what we have to do. So to complete the square, we want to move the constant to the other side and just leave my x's on one side. So x squared plus 4x is equal to -5, and I'm going to leave a space because that's what's going to be the number that completes the square. So the formula I use is b over 2 squared. My b is always the number in front of the x, so this would be 4 over 2 squared. 4 over 2 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So technically I'm adding 4 on the left side. That means I need to add 4 to the right side too. And then in my parentheses squared, I always take the variable that's squared here and the variable that's squared here. So x plus 2. And then that's equal to -5 plus 4, which would be -1. Our next step, we're going to solve for x. So this looks just like the questions we did from the quiz. Whenever your parentheses squared are all by itself, you want to take the square root of both sides, so it cancels out with the squared. So x plus 2 is equal to the square root of -1, which we just did in the last question. Take the negative out, make it an I, and the square root of 1 is just 1. So this would be plus or minus I. Don't forget, every time you take the square root of both sides, you need that plus or minus. So it's plus or minus I. And then the very last step is we need to move that 2 to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 2 on both sides. We can't combine the 2 and the I. They are not like terms, so I just leave it as -2 plus or minus I. So this is the same steps that we were doing before, but it's just one additional step in the beginning. We have to divide out the GCF. Get rid of it. We don't need it. All right, so looking at number 10. So again, here we start with a number that's not 1 in front of our x squared, so we know we have to divide out the GCF. So I'm going to divide everything by 4. So this becomes x squared plus 8x. I'm going to leave a space to complete the square. My constant is already on the right side, so that's perfect. -68 divided by 4 is -17. So once I have it set up, I'm going to include my b over 2 squared in that spot, and my b here is 8. So this would be 8 over 2 squared. 8 divided by 2 simplifies to 4, so this is 4 squared, and 4 squared is 16. So I'm adding 16 on the left side here. I need to add 16 on the right side too. And then in my parentheses squared, I include the x and the 4. So this would be x plus 4. And then that's equal to -17 plus 16, which is -1. And from here, we solve. So we take the square root of both sides, cancel out with the squared. Anytime we take the square root of both sides, I need a plus or minus. So I have x plus 4 is equal to plus or minus square root of -1, which we just did in the last 2 examples, and we know that that is I. Because we take out the negative, turns into an I, and the square root of 1 is just 1. And then the very last step is we subtract 4 on both sides. I can't combine 4 and I. They are not like terms, so I leave it separate. So I have -4 plus or minus I. That plus or minus sticks with the I, and the -4 just goes right in front of it. That's our answer. All right, so let's look at 11. So for 11, it looks a little bit different than what we're used to. We're used to having our x squared already there, but we're going to make it look like that, and then we're going to complete the square. But first I have this number out front. I don't like it when I have a number being multiplied to my x squared, so I'm going to divide both sides by 6. So I can do this to start, or I can do it in the second step after I distribute, but it's easier just to do it at the start because you're only dividing the 6 in the beginning, it cancels, and then the 6 at the end. So I have negative 42 divided by 6, which would be negative 7. Then here I have x times x plus 2. This is supposed to be one equation. I just wrote it far away, but it's fine. The next step is distribute the x to both of these terms. So I have x squared plus 2x. I'm going to leave a space to complete the square, and that's equal to negative 7. Didn't do anything to the right side, so it stays the same. Now once I have that space there, in that space I'm going to include my b over 2 squared. So my b is 2, so this would be 2 over 2 squared. 2 over 2 is 1, and 1 squared is 1. So I'm adding 1 on the left side. That means I need to add 1 to the right side too. And then in my parentheses squared, I need to include the x and 1. So this would be x plus 1. And that's equal to negative 7 plus 1, which is negative 6. So once I have it set up, I take the square root of both sides. So the square root and the squared cancel. Anytime we take the square root of both sides, I have to include my plus or minus. This is plus or minus. I can simplify the square root of negative 6 by taking the negative out and turning it into an I. And then let's see if we can break down 6. 2 factors of 6 are 2 and 3. That's as far as I can go, and I don't have any pairs, so it doesn't simplify. So it's just the square root of 6. But we need to take that I out to simplify it just a little bit. And then the last step is to get the x all by itself. So I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides. Get that 1, cancel. So I have x is equal to, I cannot combine negative 1 and I square root 6, so I leave it separate. So negative 1 plus or minus I square root 6. So for this question, we just had to divide the number to start. So we divided the number out front, and then the second step was distribute. So this had just 2 additional steps before we could actually go in and complete the square. Number 12 is the same. So when it looks like this, you want to divide the number out front. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. It just cancels out with the 2 there. So then I have x times x minus 2. And 200 divided by 2 is 100. Second step, just like we did in the last one, is to distribute. So this would be x squared minus 2x. I'm going to leave a space to complete the square, and it's equal to 100. So our 2 additional steps here were to divide the number and then distribute. And then from here, we do the same thing that we have been to complete the square. I need to include my little formula, b over 2 squared. B would be negative 2, so negative 2 over 2 squared. Negative 2 over 2 would be negative 1, and negative 1 squared is positive 1. So I'm adding 1 on the left side. That means I also need to add 1 to the right side too. And then in my parentheses squared, I include the x and the negative 1. So it's always whatever is being squared here and whatever is being squared here. So this would be x minus 1. And then that's equal to 100 plus 1, which would be 101. And then from here, to get rid of the squared, we square root both sides. Anytime we take the square root of both sides, we need our plus or minus there. So this would be x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus 101. We can try to find the factors of, I think it's prime. So we're just going to leave it as the square root of 101. If it is prime. The last step is we want to add 1 to both sides. So x is equal to, I can't combine 1 and a square root. They are not like terms, so I just leave it separate. So I have 1 plus or minus square root of 101. That's our answer. All right, so after you turn in the video, after you watch the video and turn in the notes, start the homework. So there is a 3.3 part 2 homework, which is due Tuesday morning.